Emma Wingate. So without further ado, I'll jump right in, starting the timer at 8 minutes. Let's face the obvious, coal mining is a messy business. When dealing with a cancer-causing substance like coal, we understand that there are necessary risks that must be taken to provide energy for the United States. But what about unnecessary risks? What if we could both create energy and stay safe? It is because my partner and I believe that coal should not be dumped into streams we stand resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reform its energy policy. Now, before we get into the how and the why of the current system, it's going to be helpful to define a few key terms, starting with definition number 1, energy policy. Energy policy. The Oxford Research Encyclopedia says that, quote, energy policy comprises rules concerning energy sources, efficiency, prices, energy from a broad infrastructure, and climate and environmental aspects of energy production, utilization, and transit, end quote. The second definition we're going to look at today is that of the Stream Protection Rule, or SPR. SPR. According to the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, quote, the Stream Protection Rule, SPR, updates rules that are over 30 years old in order to more completely implement the law, to better protect the health and safety of the people and the environment from the adverse effects of surface and underground coal mining, end quote. So now that we have our terms defined, let's look at the facts of the current system, starting with fact number 1. The Stream Protection Rule repealed, or SPR repealed. SPR repealed, according to Vox News on February 2nd, 2017. Quote, in early February, the House and Senate voted to repeal the so-called Stream Protection Rule. President Trump signed the bill, which means the Stream Protection Rule is now dead. Coal companies will have a freer hand in dumping mining debris in streams, end quote. The repeal of this rule might seem insignificant, but let's take a look at our second fact. And that is the fact of 91% exceed standards. 91% exceed standards. Earth Justice, a nonprofit public interest environmental law organization, on November 6, 2019 said this, quote, for decades, utilities have disposed of coal ash dangerously, dumping it in unlined ponds and landfills where the toxins leak into the groundwater. According to industry's own data, more than 95% of the coal ash ponds in the United States are unlined. Legal and technical experts from Earth Justice, the Environmental Integrity Project, and partner organizations located and analyzed the data disclosures. Based on that data, 91% of these plants are contaminating groundwater with toxic substances at levels exceeding federal safe standards, end quote. So judges, according to this piece of evidence, coal ash is being dumped extremely dangerously. In fact, 91% of plants are contaminating water. So with the state of the current system laid out, let's take a look at the problems and our harms, starting with harm number 1, 2,000 miles filled. 2,000 miles filled. In an article written by the Union of Concerned Scientists on December 6, 2017, they say, quote, mountaintop removal is a highly destructive process of flattening entire mountains to uncover thin coal seams that are not accessible by traditional underground methods. After clear-cutting forests and removing vegetation, explosives are used then to blast away the tops of mountains, sometimes destroying as much as 600 feet or more of elevation. The resulting debris is typically dumped into the valleys below. To date, the practice has buried more than 2,000 miles of headwater streams and polluted many more, end quote. This evidence shows that mountaintop removal, a form of coal mining, is responsible for filling more than 2,000 miles of streams. But that's not the only harm in the current system. The second harm, cancer. Cancer. According to a peer-reviewed study led by Michael Hendricks, a professor in the Department of Environmental Health at Indiana University, that was published in 2011, quote, a 5% higher cancer rate translates to an additional 60,000 people with cancer in Central Appalachian mountaintop mining counties, end quote. This evidence clearly shows that 60,000 known cases of cancer are directly linked to mountaintop removal, but that's not all. The third harm you can write down as 1,200 deaths. 1,200 deaths. Further evidence from Michael Hendricks says, quote, when you look at excess mortality, adjusting for age and smoking and all of these other variables, the number of excess deaths every year comes to about 1,200 people who live in these mining communities compared to other parts of the Appalachian region where mountaintop removal does not take place, end quote. 1,200. That is the number of people dying every year because coal companies are dumping their toxic waste into streams. This is a horrendous practice that needs to be stopped, which is why we propose the following plan. Our mandate is to reenact the Stream Protection Rule by overturning Resolution 38, 115th Congress. Our plan will be enforced by the OSMRE and any other necessary bodies, will be passed immediately upon an affirmative ballot, and the coal companies will be providing any necessary funds for the changes they'll have to make. You may be wondering what exactly the Stream Protection Rule does, so for clarification, I will give a short summary. Under the Stream Protection Rule, it will be illegal for the coal companies to dispose of toxic waste dangerously and will halt the practice of dumping the debris into streams. It outlines how to properly collect data and monitor streams to make sure they aren't being harmed or becoming harmful, and it requires coal companies to restore streams if they do harm them. We have a copy of the SPR's extensive summary in the 1AC with helpful pieces underlined if the negative team wants more detail. So now that we have a plan and know it will work, let's take a look at the advantages it will bring about. Starting with advantage number 1, cleaner streams and forests. Cleaner streams and forests, according to the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement. On January 9th, 2017, quote, OSM asserts that changes in mining practices resulting from the Stream Protection Rule will likely reduce adverse impacts on the environment and human health. The agency projects that the proposed rule will improve water quality because fewer stream miles will be adversely affected, end quote. The article then goes on to say that roughly 300 streams will be improved annually. Cleaner streams leads us to our second advantage. Lives saved. Lives saved. The toxic waste from the coal companies has been killing people for years, and the Stream Protection Rule stops the companies from continuing this practice. It is easy to see that with the SPR repassed, we will be preventing these deaths and saving lives. Passing this plan will improve the quality of our streams and put an end to the loss of lives we are seeing in the status quo. Dumping coal into streams poses unnecessary risk that is hardly needed. Because with our plan, we can continue mining coal, but in a far safer way. That is why I urge you, pass the Stream Protection Rule. Thank you so much, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
All right, excuse me. And assuming everyone is ready, then we will go ahead and get started with cross-examination with 3 minutes on the clock. All right, first of all, great speech. In fact, it was so good that we would sincerely love a copy of that sent over to us at your earliest convenience.
Thank you. And Jeremiah will send that right away.
Okay, perfect. Can you agree that within a team policy debate round, you must solve for your harms?
Yes, that is one of our burdens of proof.
Perfect. So you need to fix the problems that you've addressed within the round today.
Yes.
Okay. Can you agree that the Stream Protection Rule is an extension of the SMCRA, or the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act?
Well, essentially, the SPR, as I said in my definition, the SPR improves.
Absolutely. I absolutely understand the definition. But can you agree that that improvement is basically a revision to the SMCRA? So it's just adding to that law that already exists. Can you agree to that?
I won't necessarily agree. It does not duplicate that act, but...
No, I'm saying it duplicates whatsoever. Can you agree that it doesn't duplicate it? It just adds on. It tacks on to that act.
Sure, and there's also more benefits that we can get onto later.
Perfect. So you mentioned that companies were already not meeting standards. You brought up a figure of 91% of coal ash ponds and the effects there. So I have a question. If coal companies are already not meeting standards, how will another standard help?
Well, as I said, and as you understand in the definition, we're revising rules. In the current system, there's loopholes so these coal companies can dispose of their toxic waste dangerously. We fixed that, and with the stream protection rule, they won't be allowed to do that anymore.
Okay, so if under current law, there was a belief that there were no loopholes. If this standard, if you believe there are no loopholes, can you, under your own contention, certify that companies will not be able to, quote unquote, abuse this law?
Can you repeat the question or rephrase it, please?
No worries. We'll just move forward. So Can you agree that most of your evidence was referring to mountaintop mining?
Well, yes, it was referring to mountaintop removal, and that's perfect because the SPR directly affects mountaintop removal and will tell these companies to stop dumping their waste into streams.
Perfect. Absolutely. You're just reinstating the law in its current form, right? The SPR?
Can you repeat the question?
No worries. We'll move forward one more time. So do we generally have a company that a law is being imposed upon pay for that law? So if we're passing a nutrition law, do we have McDonald's pay for that law to be enacted?
I'm not exactly sure, but if you're bringing that question up in response to our plan, this shouldn't cost the coal companies that much money. And as we've seen, lives outweigh costs.
Finish with one last question. So sorry. Can you agree that you should provide some sort of quantifiable benefit for your plan?
Sure, yeah, and there's definitely benefits we can see from our plan.
Okay. Thank you so much. No further questions.
Of course.
The negative team will start prep time at 5 minutes. Stopping negative prep time at 4 minutes and 32 seconds. All right. Assuming that everyone is ready, I will set my timer to 8 minutes. And we can go ahead and get started. The stream protection rule is not a rule that we should place on the United States as a whole. And it's because the negative team believes this that we ask that you vote for the negative side. In this first negative constructive of today's debate round, I'll be explaining essentially the philosophy behind the stream protection rule and why it's a harmful policy, and then going on to explain how our current system does protect the stream, and finally how the affirmative team doesn't actually solve the problems that they presented in today's debate round. So let's go into my first point, and you can tag this as the blanket policy, a blanket policy. What the affirmative team is passing is a blanket policy, a policy that applies to our entire nation. And the problem with that is it's based on the justification from a couple of small areas. And so my first subpoint is little mountain mines. Little mountain mines. The majority of the evidence from the affirmative team's constructed was about mountaintop removal mining and how they dump the minerals from the mountaintop mining into these streams, and people are getting cancer and dying. The problem with this is that they're applying a stream protection rule based on at a maximum 20 mountaintop mines in the United States. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, they published a table in January of 2019, and they showed the types of mines that were in the United States. And they have a graph. And according to this graph, at most, there are 20 mountaintop mines in the United States. 20 mountaintop mines. Furthermore, these mines are concentrated in a single area. And that's my second subpoint. Concentrated mines. Concentrated mines. According to the U.S. Energy Administration back in July of 2015, they showed a chart of where all the mountaintop mines were in the United States. And they're all in one concentrated area on the edge of Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. So all these mines, these 20 mines, are in a single concentrated area of the United States. And so what the affirmative team is doing is they're taking what's happening in one concentrated area and applying it to the entire United States. And so what we'd ask, how will this affect mines in Alaska? How will this affect mines in other places across the United States? It's a blanket policy, not dealing with the issue on a case-by-case basis. And that's my third subpoint, nationwide application. Nationwide application. Chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, warned in October of 2015 when the stream protection rule was first proposed, that, quote, the scientific studies that reportedly justify the proposed rule appear anemic at best. Studies with concentrated focus on a single geographic region is hardly a representation sample that can be applied nationwide. I doubt very much that the Interior Department bothered to conduct any research in Alaska, where climate and permafrost alone will likely prohibit compliance with the new regulations, end quote. So the reality is different states have different environments. So they're justifying applying this nationwide rule based on a small area of mountaintop mines. So it's a nationwide application. What's the impact of that? And that's my second point. Blanket policy hurts us. Blanket policy hurts us. Applying a blanket policy across our entire nation with only maybe justifying it for 20 mountaintop mines in a small area is not a good idea. And there's two reasons. First, inconsiderate and inaccurate policy. It's an inconsiderate and inaccurate policy. Todd Parfit, director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, testified before Congress in October of 2015, again when the rule was proposed. And they explained, quote, the rule is a one-size-fits-all regulation that imposes nationwide standards without consideration for the fundamental regulatory, environmental, ecological, or economic differences amongst the states, end quote. So again, they're looking at these 20 mountaintop mines in one concentrated area and applying it as a one-size-fits-all regulation across the entire nation, not taking into account the different regulatory, environmental, ecological, or economic differences among the states. This is a policy that is inconsiderate and inaccurate because they're only looking at this concentrated area, not the nation as a whole. And then the second subpoint, maybe even more important, is a violation of states' rights. Their policy is a violation of states' rights. Having been asked to review the stream protection rule and its environmental impact statement, the chief state mining regulators from Alabama, Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming wrote to the Office of Surface Mining in November of 2010, explaining, quote, given that the EIS and proposed rule are intended to be national in scope, we are mystified by the paucity of information and analysis for those areas of country beyond Central Appalachia, where these mines are, and the related tendency to simply expand the latter regional experience to the rest of the country in an effort to appear complete and comprehensive. In many respects, the draft EIS appears very much like a cut and paste exercise, utilizing sometimes unrelated pieces from existing documents in an attempt to create a novel approach to the subject's matter. And Colonel Randy Huffman, Secretary of West Virginia's Department of Environmental Protection, testified before Congress in October of 2015. Quote, the stream protection rule's one-size-fits-all attempts to regulate biological condition and ecological function is squarely in conflict with state clean water laws. Biological condition and ecological function are not protected by numeric quality data, end quote. And furthermore, he goes on to say, quote, one of the shortcomings of the stream protection rule is that it is full of unlawful conflicts with federal and state clean water laws. Importantly, Section 303 of the Clean Water Act allocates primary responsibility for development of water quality standards to the states, end quote. Now, that was several pieces of very technical evidence, but essentially what it says is the stream protection rule violates states' rights to regulate their water. Section 303 of the Clean Water Act allocates the rights of states as the primary responsibility for regulating their clean water. So it's an inconsiderate and inaccurate policy that violates states' rights, a blanket policy that we should not pass. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't protect our streams. And that leads me to my third point. Streams are protected. Streams are protected. The status quo has a system that protects streams but does not violate states' rights, and it does it on a case-by-case, state-by-state basis. So my first subpoint is mountaintop mines require permits. Mountaintop mines require permits. The Congressional Research Service published in April of 2015, quote, mountaintop mining and other surface coal mining operations typically require two types of permits, a Section 404 permit and a Section 402 permit, end quote. Now, my second subpoint is permits protect the environment. Permits protect the environment. The U.S. Energy Information Administration published in July of 2015, quote, in order to conduct mountaintop removal operations, a permit must be granted. The publication goes on to say, if the mining operation will include a valley fill, which allows the overburden to be deposited into intermittent or perennial streams, an additional permit must be granted. They go on to say, quote, the standard for issuance of a 404 permit is consideration of full public interest by balancing the favorable impacts of a proposed activity against the detrimental impacts. A discharge is categorically prohibited if it would significantly degrade water quality. In addition, no discharge may be allowed if there is a less environmentally damaging practical alternative, end quote. So the permits administered by the government protect our streams without violating states' rights. And this leads me to my final point, problems unsolved. If you remember back to the first affirmative constructive, they made the contention that 91% of mountaintop mines and mines in the United States violate the current rules. Now, they said essentially that's the case because there's loopholes in those rules and there's not loopholes in the stream protection rule. I went back and looked at their 1AC. Never once does the study they quote say they were loopholes. It just says that these mines violate these rules. So for all we know, the states and what's likely is that these mines will continue to violate the rules whether or not we have the stream protection rule. So because they're passing a blanket policy that hurts the United States, that hurts the states and doesn't solve the problem, we ask you to vote negative. I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Okay, awesome. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Again, this is Emma Wingate, starting cross-examination at 3 minutes. All right, first, congratulations for making it to semifinals. I just have a couple of quick questions for you.
Thank you. Congrats to you.
Thank you. Is coal being dumped into streams a good thing?
That totally depends on the cost-benefit analysis.
Okay. So you mentioned a table under your mountain mines point. Could you send that to the chat box?
Absolutely. In a second when I get back to the table.
Thank you so much. So you talked about how the mines were concentrated and therefore we aren't helping a significant amount of people. Would that be your contention?
No, so essentially my contention was that the mines are concentrated in a small area. And so you're taking evidence from that small area and applying it across the entire nation, not taking into account the different ecological systems, environments, and economic systems across all these states.
Okay, sure, we can address that. Do you know how long 2,000 miles is?
5,280 feet times 2,000?
Yes. You know how long essentially that would be?
I mean, based on my concept of a mile, yes.
Okay. How many states use mountaintop removal? Do you know off the top of your head?
According to the chart published by the U.S. Energy and Information Administration in July of 2015, the majority of mountaintop mines are in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia in one small section.
Okay, interesting. We can address that later. What version of the stream protection rule did your evidence refer to?
That was the version that you're bringing back in, specifically the version that was passed that was repealed by Trump.
Okay, we can address that later. Would you agree that our plan isn't just for mountaintop removal?
Yes, and that's exactly my contention. You're doing it based on mountaintop removal and applying it to all streams across the entire United States. That's a blanket policy that should be done on a case-by-case basis. Okay,
interesting. We'd love to respond to that. Does water stay in one state?
I would guess not.
Yes. Okay. You talked about how streams are protected. How do you account for the 2,000 miles being filled?
So if it's essentially, there's two options. Essentially, the current system protects streams and the permits work, or they don't, and there's no reason to believe that an extra law will make it work even more.
Okay, interesting. Thank you so much for your answers. No further questions.
All right. No further prep time, or no prep time will be needed for this speech. For clarification's sake, my name is Jeremiah Mosbey, and this is the second affirmative constructive. I'm just going to assume that everyone is ready, and with that, I will go ahead and get started with my speech. The stream protection rule should be passed. Over the course of this speech, what I'm going to be doing is traveling down the flow. I'm going to be responding to all of the arguments that the negative speaker brought up, and I'm going to be showing you how none of them stand. So hopefully, by the end of this speech, you will realize that the stream protection rule is a good policy that needs to be passed. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. His first argument was talking about a blanket policy, and he had several subpoints under this. But basically, his main point was that we're taking just a few states, or that MTR only happens in a few states, and we're taking a policy and applying it to the entire nation. So his first subpoint was little mines. You can tag my response to this as big impact. Big impact. And as a subpoint under this, you can write down 2,000 miles. 2,000 miles. So while it may be true that there are only around 20 mountaintop removal mines, the number of mines is not what is important in this debate round. What is important is how much those mines affect the environment. And again, as you can see in the 1AC, 2,000 miles of streams have been filled. Let me put that into perspective for you. 2,000 miles is roughly the length of the Mississippi River. 2,000 miles is roughly the distance from Hawaii to California. This is not a little number. This is a lot of streams that have been completely buried because of the way that coal companies are disposing of their waste. So while there may be a few mines, these little mines have a big impact. The next thing that he said was basically talking about nationwide application. You can write down my response as current mines. Current mines. We as the affirmative team believe that you should try to prevent problems and not go behind the problems and solve them as they come. We believe that the problems should be prevented. So what does this mean? Well, it means that even if there are only a few mines in a small area right now, there could be more mines later. So if we did what the negative team is proposing, we would have to go in behind when more mines are created and make more policies. And this is not what we want to do. But now I'd like to move on to my more important response to his argument about blanket policy. And again, this is a very important to realize, and that is that the states will be recognized. The states will be recognized. I have a piece of evidence here from the Office of Surface Mining accessed in 2019. It says, quote, the SPR continues to recognize state primacy in the regulation of surface coal mining and reclamation operations. Primacy states can and should tailor their regulatory programs to local conditions, provided that these programs meet the minimum requirements and are no less effective than the federal regulations as revised by the SPR, end quote. So what does this piece of evidence show us? Well, it shows that states will be recognized under our plan. What does it mean? It means that since the SPR is specifically tailored to each individual state, it is not a blanket policy. This piece of evidence clearly shows that the entire negative argument about the blanket policy does not stand. But the final argument he made was about state rights, and as this evidence clearly shows, state rights are recognized. If that wasn't enough for you, I have a piece of evidence here from the Library of Congress. It's a quote from a Supreme Court case that says this, quote, a pre-enforcement challenge to the constitutionality of the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, which by the way is the act that we are updating, was presented in a federal district court action. The act is designed to establish a nationwide program to protect society and the environment from the adverse effects of surface coal mining operations. In the context of a facial challenge, the act is constitutional, end quote. So what does this piece of evidence show? Well, it shows according to the Supreme Court, the act is constitutional because state rights are recognized. So with the argument about blanket policy out of the way, let's move into the next negative argument that was made, and that is about streams being protected. And he talked about how permits have to be given for mountaintop mining operations to happen. You can tag my response as loopholes. Loopholes. The problem with the current system, the problem with the permits in the current system is that there are loopholes. Now, my opponent said that he looked at our 1AC and nowhere in the pieces of evidence did it talk about loopholes. The thing is, it's not specifically in a piece of evidence. In the back of the 1AC, we do have an executive summary of exactly what the SPR does. The very first thing that it does is it redefines what is considered harmful to the environment. This is the loophole in the current system. There are certain laws and regulations, and there are loopholes within those laws that say that basically dumping coal into streams is okay because it doesn't hurt the environment under the definition. The SPR fixes this loophole by updating the definition. And this is also a response to his second argument, talking about the problems being unsolved. His argument here was that since 901% already exceeds standards in the current system, there's no reason to believe that it will happen under our plan. Again, the problem with this is that he's not taking into account the loopholes that we are solving for. I'm going to take a moment to explain why these loopholes exist in the current system. You can write this down as SMCRA. SMCRA. Now, I know this is a long acronym, but essentially what it is it's the law that the SPR is updating. So in the current system, the SMCRA is the act protecting streams. This is the act with loopholes in it. The reason why there are loopholes is because it is over 30 years old. Over 30 years old, as we stated in our definition. The Stream Protection Rule updates this ancient law and brings it up to date so that these loopholes don't exist. There have been significant technological advances in these 30 years, and the SPR is what accounts for them. So, what can we see from this speech? Well, the biggest thing that we can see is that the SPR is not a blanket policy in any way. Again, I read a couple of pieces of evidence showing you how states will be recognized and it is constitutional because their rights will not be infringed upon. The second thing that we can see is that the streams are not being protected in the current system. 2,000 miles of streams have been filled, which has led to 60,000 extra cases of cancer every year and 1,200 extra deaths each year. And that is a direct result of the loopholes in the laws in the current system. The final thing that we saw is that the Stream Protection Rule would fix these loopholes, meaning that coal would no longer be dumped into streams, which would mean that the harms would go away. So at the end of the day, the Stream Protection Rule still stands. And because I believe that coal should not be dumped into streams, that I stand resolved. You should pass the Stream Protection Rule. Thank you so much. I do now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay. If the affirmative speaker is ready.
Sure, go ahead.
Great. Let's begin. First, congratulations on making it to semifinals.
Yes, you too.
Thank you. So, can you agree with my contention wasn't that the impact of mountaintop mines was small, but rather that the amount of them was small, and thus the area we're looking at is small?
I would disagree with the fact about the area because, again, 2,000 miles is a
what
pretty...
I was contending with the evidence that I showed was that we're looking at one small area of mountaintop mines and applying it to the nation.
I'm not sure what you mean by that because, again, the Stream Protection Rule is specifically tailored to the area where the mines
talking about that, can I get that piece of evidence that says it's tailored specifically to the state?
Absolutely.
And to clarify about that, so the Stream Protection Rule what does it do if it just allows states to make their own regulations?
So basically what the Stream Protection Rule does is it sets up a minimum federal standard, and then furthermore, depending on the area, depending on a minimum
federal standard across the nation.
That is one of the things it does, yes.
Okay, awesome. That's great. And then can I just get that piece of evidence? And then also could I get that piece of evidence about it being constitutional?
Absolutely.
Great. Now, so you talked about the loopholes, and you talked about this for quite a while. Did you ever read a piece of evidence?
Did I ever read a piece of evidence? I didn't read a specific piece of evidence. What I did was I referenced R1AC and exactly what the Stream Protection Rule does.
Yeah, and you talked about the SMCRA, and you said the current system is loopholed because the SMCRA is old, correct?
That's one reason why there could be a problem.
And just to clarify, you never read a piece of evidence, yes or no?
No, because Emma already did that in the 1AC.
Okay, and so did you ever read any evidence that the permits that I was talking about are issued under the SMCRA?
Did I? Can you rephrase that?
Because you said this current system is loopholed because this SMCRA is loopholed, but you never addressed my permits.
Well, here's what we can see is that there are permits saying that we should do certain things, and those certain things aren't happening. That's only because of loopholes.
But you don't know whether or not these permits are under the SMCRA.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Okay. Okay, we can move on. So you talked about the SMCRA is 30 years old. Has the SMCRA been updated since 30 years ago?
I do not believe so.
Okay, great. Now, going back to the state's argument, we can agree that it would be more efficient to do this on a state-by-state, case-by-case basis.
No, because again, that would mean that we have to follow behind and pick up the harms and start. Sorry, excuse me. It would be better to prevent the harms, stop them before they happen, than go around, follow behind, and pick up what's left.
You said states' rights weren't violated, but did you ever respond to my contention that the SPR doesn't take into account the economic, ecological, and environmental differences between states?
I read 2 pieces of evidence specifically saying that the SPR would be tailored to the states.
Okay, great. Thank you. No further question.
All right.
No prep time is needed. All right, and with 8 minutes on the clock, I'd like to go ahead and jump right in. Again, this is Zacarias Negron, and I am your second negative speaker. All right. So as I get started with this speech, I'd like to point out the fact that I live at the foot of the beautiful Appalachian Mountains in Tennessee. And before I begin, I'd like to take you through a journey through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Throughout this round, the affirmative team has been alleging that 2,000 miles is the distance to fly to Hawaii. 2,000 miles is the distance across the Pacific Ocean. And while those numbers might sound big, let's take a quick hike through the Great Smoky Mountains. As we go through these beautiful Appalachian foothills, you'll see that there are tens of thousands of hiking trails. Tens of thousands of miles of hiking trails. Because when you're in the mountains, paths and streams alike tend to curve and twist and squiggle along, which means that their surface area is taken up for more account. If just one person littered one bag of potato chips on one hiking trail, on those tens of thousands of hiking trails just within a 50-mile radius of me, then you could say that, with all due account, over 2,000 miles of these trails were polluted. So while it might sound like a huge number, within this speech we'll actually see that the significance of the affirmative team's plan is severely lacking. There are no quantitative benefits. Within the end of her cross-examination, the affirmative speaker explained to me that there should be a quantitative benefit for their plan. I turn you to the Congressional Research Service, which explained in January of 2017, quote, the Office of Surface Mining, mind you, that's the office that will be implementing the plan that the affirmative team has proposed and that wrote this proposal, could not quantify benefits of the proposal, end quote. Even the administrative agency that will be implementing this plan for the affirmative team and that wrote the plan during the Obama administration could not quantify the benefits of the proposal. And this brings me to another issue, the timeline. They've brought up the point that the SMCRA was first proposed 30 years ago, but they failed to account for the fact that the SMCRA has been regularly updated since then, its last update actually being a stream buffer rule under the Bush administration right before Bush left office. The SPR was first written and conceived, what they intend to pass today was first written and conceived at the very beginning of the Obama administration, and since then has seen little update, and was finally passed during the last days of the Obama administration, meaning that we would be implementing a policy that is over 8 years old, a little less than 8 years old, and without any due update to benefit our streams and to benefit our nation in ways that would actually be applicable. I'd like to move forward and turn you to another issue. The SPR nationalizes a regional problem. Certainly in Appalachia, we can see that there might be a bit of an issue. States are addressing that, and states have the authority to do so. But having been asked to actually review this stream protection rule from the federal government and its environmental impact, the chief state mining regulators from Alabama, Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wyoming wrote the Office of Surface Mining that they found that it was quite interesting, quote, for this proposed rule intended to be in a national scope, they were mystified by the paucity of information and analysis, which means the lack of information and analysis for those areas of the country beyond central Appalachia. They also found that the studies within the law were cut and paste examples of unrelated pieces of evidence from existing documents, trying to create a novel approach to the subject matter. What they found was that this plan doesn't actually solve the problem intended to do, and it nationalizes a regional problem. Secondly, their plan lacks significance because coal mining, even within that one region of Appalachia, is declining rapidly. A study commissioned by the federal government in January of 2018 found conclusively that coal production fell by nearly 45% overall in Appalachia between 2005 and 2015, more than double the rate of national decline in coal production. And that's not even just during those years. The Congressional Research Service updated that with projections showing that it is expected and that it will decrease 15% more during the next few years from 2020 to 2040. Now, at this point, I'd like to address something that has been a white elephant within the room for us, and that's the issue of health impacts. One of the harms of the affirmative team, which they have to solve, is just entitled cancer. Not only is it unfortunately worded because we cannot cure cancer with the SPR, but secondly, their other harm, 1,200 deaths, is unsubstantiated. Both cancer and 1,200 deaths are actually not directly related to coal mining in any way. Their study that they provided for that was written in 2011 using rates from 2010. Now, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences conducted a study on the community health impacts of mountaintop removal mining in July of 2017. It was authored by over 9 health experts, and it found conclusively that the results of all previous studies were inconsistent, and few studies reported the same result. They found that 11 of those studies, including the study that's cited by them today in 2011, relied on the same national data sets and were unable to consider individual level contributors to mortality, such as poor socioeconomic status or smoking. And this brings me to my impact for that point. What that means is that this allusion to cancer, this allusion to all of these deaths, which the National Institute describes further, and it can be provided to the affirmative team, was absolutely overblown. Meaning that actually these deaths, this cancer, was related in a different way to socioeconomic status and poor living conditions, and in fact, other conditions such as smoking. These are contributed to by poor economic status within this region that I'm so close to. And as we get into this further, you'll see how their plan actually exacerbates that, not only failing to solve their harms, but exacerbating their harms. The SPR rulemaking is also illegal on numerous levels. I'd like to quote a couple of court cases for you. Bragg versus West Virginia Coal Association, which was decided in a national circuit court, found that the SMCRA, the law that the affirmative team is updating, that they are amending, it designed a scheme of mutually exclusive regulation, either by the Department of Interior or by states if it elects to regulate itself. So if states would like to regulate themselves, then they should be allowed to. That is what this court ruling is saying. And it says that this federal policy, the SMCRA, quote, encourages exclusive state regulation, which was careful and deliberate. What the affirmative team is doing is it's actually destroying that precedent, which is backed up by 2 other cases. The Pennsylvania Federation of Sportsman Clubs, Inc. versus Hess, which found that SMCRA provides for either state regulation of surface coal mining within its borders or federal regulation, but not both. The SPR violates this. INRI Permanent Surface Mining Regulation litigation, which was another court case, decided that the state is the sole issuer of permits, and the federal government doing that actually violates our Constitution. This is where I'd like to turn to these loopholes. They've said that the SPR is limiting these loopholes, and it's actually going to continue to allow states to have their own policies. Well, that's actually not true. If you read the fine print within the SPR, as described by these court cases, what the SPR will actually be doing is transferring the right to permit for mining from state authorities, like the West Virginia Department of Environmental Health, instead to the federal government, limiting states' rights and not allowing states to actually fall in line with their higher and better environmental standards that are actually proposed to engage in regional issues within their very own states. It limits that. And it is unconstitutional in that essence and also violates the very law that it is going to be amended. And as such, it's drastically overblown and harmful to our economy in many ways. Thank you.
All right, assuming everyone's ready and my opponent, I'll go ahead and get started. Hey, that was a great speech, but of course it's cross-examination time, so I have some questions for you about it. The first thing that you said was that there was no quantitative benefit for the SPR, and I believe you cited a piece of evidence. What was the date on that piece?
Absolutely. That piece of evidence was in July, I believe, or excuse me, it might have been September of 2017, and that's actually from the Congressional Research Service after speaking
Would you mind dropping that piece of evidence in the box, please?
Absolutely. And that piece of evidence is from the Office of Surface Mining, which is your
All right, awesome. You were talking about the stream buffer rule. Now, was it your contention here that the stream protection rule and the stream buffer rule are the same thing?
No, it's not my contention that at all, but you said that we're basing our entire coal industry and all of the effects that this policy would have off of a policy that is over 30 years old, which is absolutely patently false.
All right. So you would agree that the stream buffer rule does not solve for the loopholes in this 30-year-old law.
You would have to provide for those loopholes. You still have not quantitatively even assessed that, just like the Office of Surface Mining under the Obama administration couldn't either.
All right. You would agree that the final text of the SPR, the final version, as we referenced in the 1AC, it redefines what's considered harmful to the environment.
Absolutely. And that definition is actually extraordinarily harmful because that definition takes power away from the states, which actually have far more rigorous and better environmental regulations based upon their state's circumstances.
All right. About that, did you ever respond to the Supreme Court case about the final SPR showing how it did not violate the state's rights?
Actually, I'll respond to that right now because that was not about the SPR. That was about the SMCRA, which is the Surface Mining Control, I believe, and Reclamation Act. And that act is what you will be updating. It's not the SPR. And that act is actually being violated by the passage of the SPR. And we have copious evidence of that. And I also brought up 3 separate court cases decided at the national level, including a Supreme Court case, which discredits.
All right. Okay. So about those cases, were those cases talking, or what were the dates on those cases? And were they talking about the final version of the SPR or a previous version?
Absolutely. So I would mind you really briefly that the date on a Supreme Court case or on any circuit court case does not matter. It's the precedent within that matters. It's legally binding. So the first one was in July of 2002, setting forward precedent. The other one was in 2015. And then we have one from 1984. And that 1984 one, that might sound old, but it is putting forward precedent for years to come.
All right, but you would agree that the SPR was revised, and we have evidence saying that the final SPR recognizes the states.
Yes, and that was through the primacy states thing, but that's unfortunately not true because primacy states are actually provided for under the current system. And what happens when you pass the SPR is you are transferring not just permit authority, but authority to actually monitor national water quality standards away from states, but to the federal government.
All right, very interesting. No further questions. Thank you so much for your answers.
The affirmative team will take prep time at 4:30. All right. Ending negative prep time at 2 minutes and 8 seconds. Okay, assuming everyone is ready, I will go ahead and get started with 5 minutes on the clock. Now, I have 11 siblings, and that means my mom has 12 children. Imagine if my mom came up to me and said, "Thad, you're hungry. I'm going to give you 6 pieces of pizza." Now, as a 15-year-old teenager, 6 pieces of pizza would be great, and maybe it makes me full. And so my mom decides, since it made Thad full, I'm going to make all my other children eat 6 pieces of pizza. So maybe my 2 older sisters could eat it, but maybe my 9-month-old younger sister would not be able to eat 6 pieces of pizza. In fact, she can't eat the majority of food. And this is essentially what the affirmative team is saying. They're looking at one small geographical area in the United States, saying this stream protection rule could help this area, and thus we're going to apply it to the entire nation. And because my partner and I believe that this is fundamentally flawed, that we would ask you to vote for the negative side. In this first negative rebuttal of today's debate round, I'll be going down the contentions of the 1AC and explaining why they do not stand, and the negative stance is correct. So let's go to my first point, small geographic area. Small geographic area. Now, his response to my contention that mountaintop mines were only 20 and they were in a small geographic area was, well, they have a big impact. My contention there wasn't significance, but rather that they're in this small geographic area that they're looking at. They may have a big impact in that small geographic area, but it's still a small geographic area. And so that's where all the information they're justifying this on is coming from. That small geographic area is not a physical representation of the entire United States. I read evidence of this, that this is a cut and paste policy, a blanket policy that will hurt the United States. My point wasn't that there was a small impact, but rather they're looking at a small geographic area, like my mom just looking at one child and saying, this worked for this one child, so we're going to apply it to everyone. That does not work. We should not pass this policy. My second point is a blanket policy hurts. A blanket policy hurts. And my first subpoint is different grounds. Different grounds. Now, he got up and said, the Supreme Court ruled that the SPR is constitutional. And I want to point out 2 things. First, that was about the USMCA, not the SPR. Second, it was from 1980. And actually, I want to point out the third thing. It decided it was constitutional on different grounds. It wasn't reviewing states' rights. The specific quote says, the act is constitutional. The act does not violate the Commerce Clause. This was a suit brought by the Virginia Surface Mining Reclaiming Association. They were doing it based on commerce concerns, not states' rights. So they have not shown in any way that it's constitutional based on states' rights. But furthermore, my second subpoint is different environments. My other contention about the fact that it's a blanket policy is it hurts our ability to accurately address the problem on a case-by-case basis. Again, they're taking this and applying it on a national scale, which does not take into account regulatory, environmental, ecological, or economic differences amongst the states. Now, his contention was essentially, well, the SPR allows states to do it themselves. It essentially just sets a federal minimum standard. And the problem is when you set a federal minimum standard, that's a nationwide application of something. Something that works for Wyoming may not at all work for Hawaii. The reality is we need to do this by a state-by-state basis. That's where we can get the most accurate and efficient levels. And then my third subpoint is what changes? What changes? So if he is right that the SPR allows states to regulate themselves, then what does change under the affirmative team's plan? If we pass their law and then states are still totally free to regulate themselves, then nothing really changes. The reality is the affirmative team needs to take a stance. Either it is a nationwide application of a rule or it's not. Either side, the negative side should win. Let's go into my fourth point. My third point. The lack of evidence for loophole. Lack of evidence for loophole. Now, they keep saying there's loopholes in the current system. And I asked if they brought up evidence, and he said, no, we simply referred back to the 1AC. I've gone through the entire 1AC. There is not one piece of evidence, one explanation of a loophole in the current system. Simply that study that says the current system isn't working well. Never once does it explain their loopholes. He justified the fact that there were loopholes by saying the SNCRA is 30 years old. 30-year-old law doesn't mean it's a bad law. 30-year-old law doesn't mean there's loopholes in the law. They've not shown us a single piece of evidence. Furthermore, he never showed us that there were loopholes in the permits that I brought up. The permit for doing mountaintop mining requires minimum environmental impact. He's not shown us one time that there are loopholes in those permits. And until they do, the reality is our stream's protected. And then that goes me to my last point, that of solvency. Solvency. So assuming, if they're right, that the status quo is not protecting our streams, that the laws in place are not already protecting them, they've not shown us for any reason why adding another law will help to protect our streams. If mining companies are ignoring the laws right now, what's to keep mining companies from not continue to ignore the laws with the SPR? The reality is the affirmative team has not proved to you that their case should be passed. They've maybe shown that it should be passed in that small geographical area, but not on a nationwide scale. So because it's a blanket policy that hurts the United States, violates rights, and because they've not shown that the current system is inadequate, we ask you to vote for the negative side.
The affirmative team will be taking some prep time, starting the timer at 5 minutes. No more prep time needed. We have 2 minutes and 11 seconds remaining. Let me write that down real quick. All right, so I will, again, my name is Emma Wingate, and this is the 1AR. I'm just going to go ahead and assume everyone is ready, and I'll begin. Judges, the negative team covered a lot in the past 2 speeches, so without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. And just to let you know, I'll be going down the flow of the 2 and C first, and then the 1 and R, grouping arguments as I go along for time's sake. Now, the 2 and C talked about the journey through the Smoky Mountains, ultimately concluding that the surface area was small. And then in the 1 and R, he also talks about the small geographic area. I'm grouping these 2 up. You can write down my response as length, not surface area. Length, not surface area. Our plan refers to the length of the streams that are being filled. That's 2,000 miles. This is still a prevalent harm in the current system that needs to be fixed. He also talked about how there was no quantitative benefit, but you can simply write down my response as benefits clear. Benefits clear. If we stop dumping coal in the streams, then lives will be saved. Cancer will stop becoming as prevalent. So we can see that the benefits are clear. Now, He also talked about how the stream protection rule nationalizes a local problem, but you can write down my response as preventive policy. Preventive policy. What Jeremiah and I want to pass is a policy that helps us prevent a problem instead of reacting to a problem. And of course, dumping coal into streams is bad, but we'll stop preventing that instead of reacting to a huge problem. Now, he also talked about how there was a lack of significance, but you can write down my response as millions of gallons daily. Millions of gallons daily. From the Chicago Tribune, on February 20th, 2019, quote, every day, many millions of gallons of water loaded with arsenic, lead, and other toxic metals flow for some of the most contaminating mining sites in the United States and into surrounding streams and ponds without being treated, end quote. So this lack of significance that the affirmative team, that the negative team claims the affirmative team has is not true, because there is a huge problem in the current system. I have lots of pieces of evidence I could read, but unfortunately, due to the time constraints, I'm not able to dive into them. But just remember, there is a significant problem. Now, he also talked about how our problems wouldn't be solved, basically saying that our study by Michael Hendricks was not good. You can write down my response. Actually, I have two responses. The first is root problem. Root problem. Again, this goes back to the fact that coal being dumped in the streams, there's being coal dumped into streams in the current system. If that stops, then logically we can conclude that there will be health benefits. But secondly, all variables taken into account. All variables taken into account. The reason Jeremiah and I use this study from Michael Hendricks is because all the variables were taken into account. If you recall back in the 1AC, it took into account smoking, obesity, etc. And their study was not as took into account lots of health impacts. Plus, all of the studies showed some impact. So at the end of the day, whether affirmative or negative, there's still a problem in the current system, whichever piece of evidence you believe. Now, he also talked about these court cases that states should regulate themselves. I have three responses. First, states given primacy. States given primacy. We already covered this in previous speeches. Secondly, the current system shows SPR needed. Current system shows SPR needed. This is logical. I've already explained this in other arguments. Thirdly, this is the most important, the final SPR. Final SPR. A misconception that the negative team has is using evidence that referred to much earlier rough drafts of the SPR. We are passing the final SPR, in our case, the revised SPR. So this is a misconception that the negative team has, that the affirmative team, their evidence doesn't actually link to the affirmative team. Then he also talked about loopholes, but again, we're updating the definition. And again, this is the final SPR. Now, moving on to the 1NR, they talked about how the blanket policy hurts. You can write down my response as tailoring to each state. Tailoring to each state. And let's just consider a question real quick. Why would moving waste harm states? It's just the SPR, essentially what it's doing is telling companies you shouldn't dump their waste into streams. You should dump it somewhere better for the environment. So this argument that they're saying really doesn't hold much ground. He also talked about what changes, lives saved in environment. He also talked about lack of evidence for loophole. But again, we don't need to prove that with evidence. It's clear to see. And we are updating definition. Again, that point still stands. We're updating the definition. So I know we covered a lot today, but it's because of all these reasons and because none of the negative team's arguments stand that an affirmative ballot is still warranted at the end of the day. Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure speaking for you.
And the negative team will take prep time.
Starting at 2:08.
No further prep time is needed. And we have 5 seconds remaining, just for the record. All right. And with 5 minutes on the clock, then let's go ahead and jump right back in. All right, so within this round, we have seen quite a bit. Yet again, I'd like to take you back through another journey just really briefly to the Smoky Mountains. I can actually see the mountains from my window right now. And as I go to actually take a hike through there, I'm not contending that their significance is small. I'm not contending that the significance of a length of 2,000 miles is small. What I'm contending is that we're basing a policy based off of 2,000 miles, which is actually not a whole lot of winding streams within the Appalachian Mountains, is absolutely an irresponsible policy. I'd like to first move forward to some voting issues. Quantifiable benefit. Quantifiable benefit. What has been uncontested throughout the entire round is a piece of evidence that was read from my speech, which was that the Office of Surface Mining, the administrative agency over administering the stream protection rule, the agency that wrote the rule, on conclusion of writing the rule and publishing their final draft, admitted that there was no quantitative benefit that could be presented to the Congressional Research Service. They admitted that. That's been sent to the affirmative team, and they still have not responded. Now, likewise, we see this through their harms. Today, they have unfortunately worded their harms. Unfortunately worded harms. Their first harm was simply entitled cancer. Their second harm was 1,200 deaths. Firstly, that harm did not specify where the deaths came from within the title. It didn't also, their first harm didn't specify that the cancer specifically came from mountaintop mining. So for all we know, if just looking at the titles of the harms, they could be attempting to cure cancer and stop just 1,200 deaths across the world. Their plan doesn't do that. And secondarily, when we move into the meat of their plan, we move into the meat of that harm, into the actual evidence, we see that logically, we cannot conclude, in contrast to the affirmative team's point, that all variables were taken into account. That study was from 2011 using figures from 2010. And our study was from July of 2017, authored by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. They conducted a study on the community health impacts of mountaintop removal of mining. I'll read another quote. They found that there is no direct link between exposures to arsenic and various other chemicals that could be present within waters and health effects within people that live in the area. They also found that all of the literature before to that point had an extreme sense of bias, with over 59% of those studies having bias that was taken into account when actually placed in the studies, meaning that those were marred with intransparency. So that benefit is no longer there. Secondly, I'd like to turn you to another point. They've said that millions of gallons are being released daily without being treated into our streams. So what's the benefit under their plan? Will that go away? Unfortunately, it actually won't, because today they're simply establishing another standard. This is happening under current standards and under their current standard that they're saying that they are going to update. What will another standard do to enforce that this doesn't happen? We have no guarantee, no expert from them that is saying that this will actually happen. Now, I'd like to move forward to a blanket policy. They admitted within cross-examination that most of their evidence was from Appalachia. And we've brought up several evidence from across the board, across the United States, saying that this plan on a national level is absolutely wrong. We're not contending that the effects of this in one geographic area could potentially be harmful in some meritable way. But what we're contending is the fact that a blanket policy harms states' rights. They have never responded to the fact in a conclusive way that taking away the right of a state to permit for its own mining, to fall in line with the National Water Quality Act, to fall in line with all of the legislations that currently occur, will not be degraded. And in fact, we've brought up various evidence throughout this round, including from Colonel Randy Huffman, who is the Secretary of the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. His job is to oversee the environmental well-being of West Virginia, and he specifically posited that the stream rule's proposed definition, even for environmental harm, adversely affects state rights and adversely affects the environment within his very own state. It's a non-holistic policy, and it's actually very harmful for us. The health effects are moot. And I'd also like to point to the fact that their plan is actually not solvent, because either one, their plan is established and companies continue not to comply, and this federal agency, which actually hasn't been stood up by the bill, will not actually be enforcing this law, or two, there will actually be some bit of a radical change. But in the meanwhile, we'll be violating the Constitution and over 4 court cases that we've brought up supporting our side. Not only violating the very act that they are amending, but the Constitution of our nation itself, taking away the right of states to be the regulators. And secondly, I'd like to end with asking if we usually pay for policies using an industry's funds. we would be mandating that the coal industry pay for this policy's implementation, something that's been unprecedented and never seen before and not responded to by the affirmative team. How do we justify that? It seems unconstitutional, and it is, and it's very irresponsible. Thank you.
Affirmative will be taking a little bit of prep time, starting the clock at 2 minutes, 11 seconds. All right. Again, for clarification's sake, I am Jeremiah Mosbey. This is the last speech of the round. I'm setting my timer for 5 minutes. Assuming that everyone is ready, I'm going to go ahead and get started. In this very last speech of the round, I'm going to be boiling down this entire debate into 3 key voting issues, the 3 main reasons why I believe that we as the affirmative team deserve the ballot at the end of today. Before I dive into those voting issues, there is one little thing that I want to address, and this is the negative team's last voting issue. That was of making the industry have to pay for this regulation. Now, there's a couple of things here. First, this is a new argument. The only time this ever got brought up was in cross-six. It was never presented in an actual constructive, and here it comes up again at the end of their very last speech. But again, this is a new argument. It's the first time it shows up on the flow and should not be accounted for. But even if we were to pretend that it's accounted for, it's an illogical argument because the industry has to pay to comply with regulations. When Bluebell ice cream was found to be harmful to human health, it was Bluebell ice cream that had to pay to adjust their formula, not the federal government giving them money to help them do that. So we can see that this point is illogical. But moving on to my voting issues. My first one you can write down as clear harms. Clear harms. Now, the negative team said that our harms were not quantitative, and yes, they read a piece of evidence from the Office of Surface Mining. However, they didn't read what else that same piece of evidence said. It said, although it's not quantitative, it is qualitative. So we have a qualitative harm in the current system, not a quantitative harm. And this brings me to my next subpoint, which you can write down as both teams agree. Both teams agree. Now, there's been some conflicting evidence, but when you look at the negative team's evidence, as you can see from that piece of evidence from the Office of Surface Mining, it clearly says there's a qualitative harm. But not only that, but when you look at the negative team's health studies, actually what those studies are concluding is that there are health impacts. What the negative team was getting at was that these studies conflict with each other, but that's only common sense. Different studies are going to conclude different things because they were done different ways. But when you actually look at those studies, when you look at the piece of evidence that they read, and when you read the fine print, it shows that there are health impacts. So this leads me to my second voting issue, which you can write down as authority to solve. Authority to solve. One thing that the negative team has said a lot is that the SPR is not constitutional and that it infringes on states' rights. You can write down my response as final SPR. Final SPR. Emma mentioned this in her last speech. All of the Supreme Court cases were very old. They were referring to previous drafts of the SPR. The SPR has undergone refinement through the years, and now we are trying to pass the final SPR. If you recall back to my last speech, I read a piece of evidence that specifically said that the final SPR would not infringe on states' rights and states would be recognized. And furthermore, that piece of evidence said the law would be tailored depending on the state. So what they're saying about a blanket policy, you can completely ignore because, again, the SPR will be tailored to each individual state. They never really responded to this point. My final voting issue you can write down as clear solution. Clear solution. And as a subpoint, you can write down updates definition. The SPR updates the definition of what is considered harmful to the environment. So all of what the negative team is saying about solvency, it really doesn't matter. They're referring to bills that are in place that have loopholes in them because what is considered harmful to the environment under the wording of the bill is actually not harmful to the environment. The very first thing the SPR does, if you look at the summary, it says, quote, first, the rule defines the term material damage to the hydrologic balance outside the permit area. Excuse me. So what that's saying is that the very first thing the SPR does is it updates this definition, gets rid of the loophole. So what can we see from these three voting issues? First, there is a clear harm in the current system. Secondly, we do have the authority to solve this problem. And finally, there is a clear solution to this problem. So, to boil it down, don't dump coal into streams. That's only common sense, and it's not infringing on anybody's rights to say that they shouldn't dump coal into streams. There is a clear harm in the current system. There is a clear solution to this problem, the SPR, and if you pass the SPR, it will result in clean water for millions of Americans. So at the end of the day, I urge you, pass the stream protection rule. Thank you.
Thank you so much for judging.